in Dostoevsky's book, Crime and Punishment, he has his main character, Raskolnikov, decides that he's going to commit a murder, and he has very good justification for the murder. And Dostoevsky's very good at this. He puts his characters into very, very difficult moral situations and gives them full justification for pursuing the pursuing the pathway that they're pursuing. And so Raskolnikov, he's broke and starving. He wants to go to law school. His sister's about to prostitute herself, roughly speaking, by marrying a guy that hates her, that she hates, and he has contempt for her, at least acts in that manner. He's trying to rescue his mother as well, who's also in dire financial straits. He goes to a pawnbroker to pawn his meager possession so that he can continue to scrape by. And she has this niece, I believe it's her niece, that's not very bright, who she basically treats as a slave and is horrible to. And so the pawnbroker has this money. Raskolnikov is in dire need. He thinks, look, I'll just kill her, because why the hell not? I'll take her money. She's not doing any good with it anyways. I'll free her niece, who's just lurking as a slave. She's got all these other people tangled up in her pawnbroker schemes. All that'll happen is the world will be a better place. And the only thing that's holding me back is conventional moral cowardice. And, you know, Dostoevsky has his character in Crime and Punishment go through days, hours and days and weeks of intense imagination about this, rationalization about this, trying to justify himself, placing himself outside the law so that he can perpetrate this act, and telling himself with all the best nihilistic arguments that the only possible thing that could be holding him back is an arbitrary sense of indoctrinated morality. And so Dostoevsky explores that. He does commit the murder, and then of course all hell breaks loose because things don't necessarily turn out the way that you want. He gets away with it, however. Well, he gets away with it technically because no one knows he did it. But he doesn't get away with it in relationship to his own conscience. And so the rest of the book explores that. Well, Dostoevsky, I believe it was in Crime and Punishment, although he makes the same point in many of his books, he makes a very fundamental point. And this is the kind of point that I think that people who haven't investigated these matters down this particular literary and philosophical pathway never grapple with. Dostoevsky said straightforwardly, if there's no God, so if there's no higher value, let's say, if there's no transcendent value, then you can do whatever you want. And that's the question that he's investigating. And you see, this is why I have such frustration, say, with people like Sam Harris, the sort of radical atheists, because they seem to think that once human beings abandon their grounding in the transcendent, that the plausible way forward is with a kind of purist rationality that automatically attributes to other people equivalent value. It's like, I just don't understand that. They believe that that's the rational pathway. What the hell is irrational about me getting exactly what I want from every one of you whenever I want it at every possible second? Why is that irrational? And how possibly is that more irrational than us cooperating so we can both have a good time of it? I don't understand that. I mean, it's as if the psychopathic tendency is irrational. There's nothing irrational about it. It's pure naked self-interest. How is that irrational? I don't understand that. Where's the pathway from rationality to an egalitarian virtue? Why the hell not every man for himself and the devil take the hindmost? It's a perfectly coherent philosophy. And it's actually one that you can institute in the world with a fair bit of material success if you want to do it. So I don't see. To me, I think that the universe that people like Dawkins and Harris inhabit is so intensely conditioned by mythological presuppositions that they take for granted the ethic that emerges out of that as if it's just a given, a rational given. And this, of course, precisely not Nietzsche's observation as well as Dostoevsky's. That's Nietzsche's observation. You don't get it. The ethic that you think is normative is a consequence of its nesting inside this tremendously lengthy history, much of which was expressed in mythological formulation. You wipe that out. You don't get to keep all the presuppositions and just assume that they're rationally axiomatic. To make a rational argument, you have to start with an initial proposition. Well, the proposition that underlies Western culture is that there's a transcendent morality. Now, you could say that's a transcendent morality instantiated in the figure of God. That's fine. You could even call that a personification of the morality. If you don't want to move into a metaphysical space, I'm not arguing for the existence of God. I'm arguing that the ethic that drives our culture is predicated on the idea of God, and that you can't just take that idea away and expect the thing to remain intact midair without any foundational support. Now, you don't have to buy that, but if you're interested in the idea, then you can read Nietzsche, because that's what he was trying to sort out. And it wasn't only Nietzsche who came to that conclusion. It was many people have come to that conclusion, but I think the two who've outlined it most spectacularly were Nietzsche and Dostoevsky. And Nietzsche is an unbelievably influential philosopher. You know, I don't think there was anyone that was more influential during the entire course of the 20th century, excepting a very, very tiny handful of other people, excepting the scientists. We won't bother with their discussion. You could put Marx in that category. You could put Freud in that category partly. But after that, the list starts to get a lot thinner, you know. So maybe there's 10 people up in that level. And Dostoevsky, of course, if anybody ever prepares a list of the top 10 greatest literary figures in the world, he would be in the top 10 list. You know, I think he's perhaps second to Shakespeare and maybe above Shakespeare in my estimation. So these aren't trivial people we're talking about, and they weren't dealing with trivial issues. Well, so then the question might be, what's at the bottom of the idea of a transcendent value? And I wanted to approach that staying out of the metaphysical domain as much as possible, because you can claim anything you want from a metaphysical perspective, and that's a big problem. And so people will say, well, why come up with the hypothesis of God, for example? God could be anything. There's a satire. The flying spaghetti monster, right, is a classic satirical representation of a deity that the atheist types use to buttress their arguments. And fair enough, you know, as a satirical idea, it's pretty damn funny. But there's things about this that aren't the least bit amusing. And the thing that's not amusing is, well, what, if anything, is our culture predicated on? Okay, so what happened? Well, Nietzsche and Dostoevsky put forth this set of propositions. And out of Dostoevsky's line of thinking, to some degree, grew Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn documented the absolute horrors of equity-predicated Soviet society, you know, and we don't learn about that, right? This I don't understand, is that what happened in the 20th century on the radical left end of the spectrum is not well documented. Students don't learn about it. Why the hell is that? We learn about World War II. We learn about what happened in the Holocaust, and fair enough, we absolutely should. But nobody knows. It's a mystery to everyone when I talk about what happened in the Soviet Union, and that's absolutely appalling. And that's to say nothing about what happened in China, which was equally horrible. The system didn't work. It was predicated on the wrong values, unless you think that that sort of thing means worked, you know, because you have to define that as well. But it collapsed under its own weight after it killed tens of millions of people. That doesn't really, and still, it's not like Russia has recovered. It doesn't seem to me like that's a very good definition of worked. Now, whatever we're doing in the West seems to work for all of its flaws. And the question is, are we just deceiving ourselves? Is it just arbitrary power politics and opinion? Or is there something at the bottom of it? So when Solzhenitsyn wrote the Gulag Archipelago, he believed that the Russians would have to return to Orthodox Christianity to find their pathway forward. And that's, of course, has made him into a reactionary in the eyes of many of his critics. But that is perhaps what is happening in Russia, although it's very difficult to tell because Putin also seems to be using his affiliation with the Orthodox Christian Church as a means to consolidate power. So the situation in Russia is unclear, but a religious revival, if that's happening in Russia, and perhaps it isn't, but if it is happening, is something that unfolds over decades and even centuries. So it's not an easy thing to evaluate when it first starts to happen. But Solzhenitsyn drew the same conclusions that Dostoevsky did fundamentally, not in exactly the same way, but very, very close. He believed, as far as I could tell, that unless people were willing to adhere to some sort of transcendent value, that they had no protection against pathological ideologies and no protection against the murderous impulses that came along with them. And I found his work I found his writing credible, powerful and credible. I don't know how you can read that book and not draw that kind of conclusion. I think people who criticize Solzhenitsyn have never read the damn book, because that book is like, it's like going into the ring with Muhammad Ali and being pummeled to death for half an hour. You know, you don't recover from it that easily. So then Jung branched off of Nietzsche. And so Nietzsche's idea was that people would have to create their own values, roughly speaking. And I think that's where Nietzsche's is his weakest, because it isn't obvious to me that people can create their own values. And I think he fell into, and I don't want to be a casual critic of Nietzsche, because that's always dangerous, given that he probably had an IQ of 260. You know, I mean, he was way the hell out there in the stratosphere, and just when you think you've understood what he was talking about, you can be bloody well sure that you didn't. But it does seem to me, and he was running out of time. He died young, you know, and he was trying to solve this problem in a rush, I would say. And he hypothesized that people would have to become supermen, overmen, roughly speaking, in order to deal with the death of God. And that idea sort of branched off into Nazi propaganda, because that's in some sense what the Nazis were trying to do with their promotion of the perfect Aryan. You know, now it's a misappropriation of Nietzsche in my estimation. And it was partly because his sister, who is a perverse creature, what would you say, doctored his work in such a way so that it was more easily appropriated by the Nazis. But there is some danger in what he said too, because you know, the question is, well, if you're going to transform yourself into the giver of values, what stops you from inflating yourself into something like a demigod and just pronouncing what the values are going to be? So that's a problem. You know, you're going to replace tradition with yourself. Well, there's dangers in that, because there's nothing to keep you humble. That's the most appropriate objection. There's nothing to keep you humble. And those things can spiral out of control very rapidly. And they did, say, in the case of Hitler. I mean, it's easy to blame what happened in Germany on Hitler, but that's a big mistake, because it was a dialogue between Hitler and the German people, right? Hitler didn't create himself. It was co-creation. He said things, people listened and told him back what to say. And then he said them and they listened and they told him back what to say. And it looped until he was the mouthpiece of their darkest desires. Now that's a game he was willing to play. But you can't think about that as, it isn't like Hitler created Nazi Germany. Hitler and the Germans co-created Nazi Germany. You know, when a leader gives articulation to the imagination of the population. That's what a leader does. And, you know, you could say that, well, maybe Hitler filtered what the Germans were telling him through a particular lens, because he had no shortage of resentment and desire for revenge in his own heart, you know. It's not like his life was a spectacular success before he became a political activist, and he was brutalized very badly in World War I, and he didn't get to pursue his primary dream, which was to be an art student in Vienna, and he had applied 3 times and got rejected all 3 times, and so he was bitter about that. He was basically living on the streets after World War I. He wasn't the world's happiest person, and I'm sure he carried a fair bit of resentment in his heart when he was in the trenches in World War I. In one experience that he had, all of his friends were killed by a mortar when he had wandered off to go do something else. So, you know, it's hard to even imagine what something like that would do to you. But I can tell you, when you're the only survivor out of 20 people, that's also going to give you an enhanced sense of your own specialness, because the alternative is just to think about how goddamn arbitrary the universe really is.